You will not do it any harm by chopping it into little pieces and putting it back together again. The lady I was writing about had 18 years without a toilet. I mean, just touching them was exciting.
Hello, I'm Hannah Lynn, and welcome to WACI, the show that celebrates successful women authors and hopefully inspires you to maybe do a bit of writing too. So today I am very excited to introduce our guest, which is the wonderful Margaret Skea. Margaret, thank you so much for coming on to WACI today.
It's absolutely a pleasure. Thank you.
So Margaret is incredible when it comes to her writing. She's hugely innovative. In fact, I remember you doing direct sales with audiobooks long before other people were talking about that kind of thing. You are always slightly ahead of the curve. So I've got a few questions and a little bit of a chat, and hopefully, yes, we will all learn some more amazing things. So Margaret, you write lots of short stories as well. Is that where it all began for you?
That is where it all began for me officially in terms of published stuff. When I was a teenager, of course, I went through the teenage angst bit where I wrote lots of poetry. I won a few poetry competitions, which was quite encouraging, but I grew out of the teenage angst and then I started writing short stories. And the first sort of published piece was Woman and Home were running a competition for unpublished writers. And I discovered it the day before the closing date. So I very, very quickly had to write a short story. And I went right back to my school exercise book, plucked out a paragraph that I'd never done anything with. And I made it the end of the story because I find it easier to write towards something than from something. And I won. And I got myself a word processor and a printer and an interview with a literary editor in London and all sorts of exciting things. So that's where it started.
That's absolutely amazing. So you took something from years and years beforehand and used it as the ending.
Yep.
That's so motivating because I think people think they have to like wait for this spark of inspiration or for this moment of the perfect story. And you're like, no, I'm going to do this. This is what I'll do to use. And which is phenomenal. So tell us a bit about how your publishing career has gone forward since then.
Right. Well, that literary editor said you need to go home and write a novel because you'll never make money out of short stories unless you're a novelist. So, of course, I went home and didn't write a novel. I continued to write short stories and got them placed in magazines and so on, and anthologies. And I didn't make any money, much. But I thought 3,000 words was my comfort zone. Until someone said to me, "You're an idiot." That's nice. They said, a novel is only 30 short stories, except you don't need a new characters, you don't need a new plot, you don't need a new location. What's your problem? And that was like a light bulb going off in my head. And so I thought, yes, maybe I could write a novel. So I wrote my first novel, which got traditionally published. And then I suddenly found that I liked writing novels. And it's kind of gone from there.
Amazing. So how long ago was it that you wrote your first novel?
That was 2012.
And you've written how many since then?
By which you realize I'm not a very fast writer because I have 5 novels, a published collection of short stories, and a contemporary biography.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, it's not a necessarily slow writer. And I think one of the things that we like to point out is everybody does things differently. Like there is no right way of writing your novel. As long as you're doing it, you know, you want to do it and you are doing it, then it doesn't matter how long it takes you, just get there. Although I do find it amusing, of course, that competition you discovered the day before closing and just wrote it and wanted to go for that. So So in your writing, do you have any unconventional habits or rituals or anything that you do to make sure you're in that writing zone?
Well, it was interesting that you said you find it hard to write at home. I find it dreadfully hard to write at home. And so variously, I have looked for other writing caves,
Mhm.
and they have ranged from I spent a month in Horthendon Castle, which was fabulous. No internet, no mobile phone reception. Um, you weren't allowed to have any noise between 9 in the morning and 6 p.m. It was like being in Purda, and it was fabulous. I just loved it. And when I came home from that, I thought I have to replicate that somehow. So the next thing was somebody I didn't even know overheard me saying I needed to go to a desert island or something. And she tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Well, I've got a derelict cottage up in the hills. Nothing's going to happen until we have planning permission for renovations. So here's the key if you want it."
That's amazing.
So I spent 8 weeks up there. I was wearing fingerless gloves, hat, scarf, coat, 2 layers underneath the coat, sitting on a sheepskin rug with another rug over my knees. And that was the start of a second book. And in that 8 weeks, I got about a third of it written just because there was nothing to distract me. Um, and now my writing cave is friends who are in Shetland currently working, and I set myself up in their kitchen and I write there. And as soon as I walk through the door, it's like Pavlov's dogs. I can just
Yeah.
start. But sadly, they're coming home. So I might have to train myself to work in my own office at my own desk.
Oh no. I have to say I love writing I've got my little office now in the garden and I love it here. I can shut myself away from it, but sometimes you just don't want to stop that flow, do you? That for me is going to these places is because the flow doesn't need to stop. If I want to wake up at 7 and start and not stop until whenever, I don't
Yeah.
have to. And that's why I find just occasionally, sort of a couple of times a year, having a couple of nights away just really sort of gets me ahead of where I need to be in terms of writing. But again, it's just like the time, how it takes you to do it. Your writing rituals are completely personal for everybody. I mean, one thing, I love to listen to loud music when I'm writing. If I'm doing a first draft, it really sort of speeds me up because I'm going with it. Whereas I know other friends that are like absolute silence. So
That's what absolute silence.
I know.
That's why Horthendon Castle writing retreat suited me wonderfully.
Yeah.
Um,
So people could
plus,
make noise in the evening. They could
yes,
make
you could be sociable in the evening and you could be sociable early in the morning, but in between,
love it. Although I wouldn't be allowed to go because if I have headphones on, then I'm singing out loudly as well. So I'd probably get kicked out of that retreat, unfortunately. So you are known for your amazingly detailed historical fictions. Obviously, you've got great research in there. What's the furthest your quest for historical accuracy's taken you? Like, is there anything you've done to the extreme?
well, I wouldn't say historical exactly. The furthest I've gone is to Angola for the contemporary biography which was the last book I finished, which I'll maybe mention later. So I was asked to write it during COVID. It took me 4 times of flights booked, flights cancelled, flights booked, flights cancelled, until I finally got there. And I was living in a village out in the bush. And the lady I was writing about had 18 years without a toilet. I don't think I could have coped with that, actually. But the bush was amazing and the people were amazing. The malaria that I caught while I was there was not amazing. So that was the furthest in distance I've gone. The furthest in time is probably, and the most exciting thing actually, was at the National Library, the Special Collections in Edinburgh, where I was just a couple of weeks ago. I was combing through handwritten letters from the late 1500s. And I mean, just touching them was exciting. One of them, which had nothing to do with what I was researching, but I couldn't resist deciphering it because it was signed your friend James R. James VI of Scotland. And just to think I was handling a letter that he'd written over 400 years ago was just amazing.
That is incredible. Yeah, it's safe to say you do not do things by halves, do you? Like Angola and 400-year-old letters. It's absolutely amazing. Okay, so some random questions that I tend to ask people just to, keep things light-hearted here. If you could have a magical power to help with any aspect of your writing, what would it be?
Speeded up by 4. But if I
Yes.
could just write and it was, yeah,
Yeah.
times 4 speed.
Okay, I get that. I get that. I think there are always so many stories, aren't there? If you're like me, that you want to write. Always so many stories I want to write that it's just like, will I ever have the time to write them all? Because you get there and there's another backlog ready to be scribbled down. I know you do lots of work with groups like the Alliance of Independent Authors and the Society of Authors. For people who don't know about them, how important are these groups for writers and authors out there?
Well, for me, I think the isolation is something that authors live with day by day. And actually, I quite like the isolation when I'm writing. But what organizations do, if you belong to them, is they're good for networking, they're good for encouragement, they're good for making connections with people. And Ally in particular is great for advice when you have a sudden issue that you don't know how to deal with it, especially in terms of marketing or something to do with your website or something like that. There's always somebody there who will jump in and say, oh, try this, or, which is fantastic. And that sense of community, which I think everybody needs a sense of community. And that's what I feel they do for me. And
Absolutely.
I think people need.
Did you discover them early on? Because for me, I was very much in that isolation for a long time of my writing. And it wasn't until the Kindle Storyteller that I was like, oh, there's all these people and all this. And of course, part of that was I wasn't living in the UK at the time. But did it take you long to find these groups, to discover them?
Yes, it did. I mean, I had discovered a local writing group reasonably early on, but have to be careful what I say here. But they were mostly much more hobby writers, and I wanted to be something more. And so therefore that wasn't particularly useful for me. But Ally have been fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was down at London Book Fair in March, which I love going to things like that as well, because you're suddenly in the middle of a buzz of the book world and author world, and it's very energizing. It's like a shot in the arm to go home and get on with it.
Yeah.
But I had a wee problem on my website, and another Ally member sat down with me for half an hour, and he had it sorted.
Yeah.
And that's invaluable.
Yeah, I agree. I think so often if you're in your bubble, you don't realize that other people have had these problems and they've solved these problems, and you can solve them a lot quicker by asking than just struggling on your own, right?
And I'm not wildly technical, so it's quite good to have other people you can go to. It's fine for you. You've got Jake.
Well, I'm quite technical too. I just like to put that out there. Actually, I used to be, but to be honest, he does do so much more of that now, to give me time for writing. Because like you said, it's about time and having that space. So yes, my technical skills are not quite what they used to be, unfortunately, not in book terms anyway. So we've talked about groups. Have you got any other advice that you'd give to aspiring authors? What would you give aspiring authors as sort of some
I
words?
think the main thing I would say is your book is not your baby. You will not do it any harm by chopping it into little pieces and putting it back together again. I really believe that ferocious editing always improves a book. And if you're too precious about it, you won't be able to do that ferocious editing. So don't think your book is your baby. You cannot do it any harm by ferociously editing it.
Great. I think that's brilliant advice. And I think also when people do have that, and I know with mine, with my first book, it took 3 years because you're trying to make this perfect baby all the time and you don't want anything to be wrong with it. And like I said, no, just edit it and also move on, maybe. That would be my advice. Right, where am I? I'm just looking down at my questions there, trying to do it subtly. Don't know if I'm getting away with it. So this one, I've only got a couple more questions left, and this one is in terms of readers. Have you had any memorable reader fan interactions before?
When I look back, the one that I remember most, and the one that was probably the most encouraging, was right back near the start when I was still writing short stories because I couldn't get myself out of the 3,000 words bit. And not the prize-winning story, but another story that Women in Home also published. And I got a letter from the Women in Home team forwarding me a letter that they had received. And it was this lady who said that the story that I'd written had changed her life for the better. It had made her reassess what she was doing, how she was living, and she made changes.
Wow.
And that was just, yeah. So I kept that letter.
Can you remember what that story was about? Can you tell us what that story was about?
I can tell you what that story was about. It was about, it was set in Belfast, and it was about a lady who was in a housing action area, an elderly lady in a housing action area. And the council were wanting to redevelop the street she was living in. And everybody else gradually moved out to the nice little houses that the council was offering them somewhere else. She didn't want to go because there was going to be compensation if you were still there when the demolition men moved in. And so she hung on and hung on and hung on until she was the only person left in the street. And the councilman who had visited her, regularly, he got caught up in her story and decided to get her the most compensation he possibly could. And she bought a static caravan overlooking a beach with that money. And it had a lovely little garden. And that was actually based on a caravan site near where I was living when I was growing up. But she had this lovely static caravan, and it had, hot water on tap, which she hadn't had in her old house. And it kind of finishes with she's watching the gulls as it happens, and she's seeing them flying around, in front of her over the sea. And she just thinks one of these days she would slip away with the gulls, but not just yet.
Wow. Oh, thank you. Thank you for sharing that one with us.
So this lady, I don't know exactly what her situation was, but she went to buy a static caravan to live where she wanted to live and do her own thing.
Yeah, you can't have inspired someone much more than that, can you? Like, that's incredible.
So I was really, I mean, it just felt lovely. Just the principle that you could change somebody's life by writing.
Yeah. It's the power of words. And I think even though obviously that is just the biggest change and the most incredible compliment, I think it's also worth remembering if you're out here, do you know what, you do change people's words for those half an hour when they get to slip away and read your book, and they get to shut off. Lots of people use reading for a way to escape. And those 30 minutes or those hour or however long it takes them to read your book, that That's not a new static caravan overlooking the Gulls, but it is an escape for lots of people. So yeah,
Yeah. And I
thank you.
mean, one of my principles when I'm writing, and because mostly they're historical, though not all, the novels are all historical, but some of the short stories are not, and the biography isn't. But my aim is to take somebody to put to somewhere they've never been before. And generally somewhere I've never been before either, actually. But it's the idea of making a you are there
Yeah.
feeling, that they just are sucked right into a different time, a different place, a different culture sometimes, and just let them be immersed in it.
I've only got one thing left to ask, which is to ask you to tell us about your latest release, where you are at the minute and what you're doing. If you could tell us about that book, because you have mentioned it already.
Yes, the latest book that's published was a commissioned biography of a lady who went out to Angola as a missionary. And she spent 34 years there right through the Civil War era when the Foreign Office wanted her to come home. So she suffered all the privations with the folk she was living among. She was living out in the bush. But she channeled humanitarian aid, medical aid, she did a lot of literacy work. After the war ended, they asked her would she teach their children. And so she physically oversaw the building of 4 mud brick schools in different villages. And she trained teachers and she imported desks and chairs secondhand from the UK. So she stocked them as well. And one of those schools, which is quite big now, is still regarded the best school in the whole Lundasol area. She tragically died of breast cancer when she was 63. And if she hadn't, she'd still be there. And so the charity that had channeled funds to her asked me, would I go and write her story? Hence the trip to Angola. Hence learning some Chokwe so that I could speak to the folk that I met, because a lot of them didn't speak Portuguese, never mind English. Well, they didn't speak English, but a lot of them didn't even speak the national language of Portuguese. So I had to learn some Chokwe, not enough for the full interviews, but enough to be able to converse with them a little bit and give them the dignity, actually, that I was, meeting them in their place.
Yeah.
And not kind, because one of the things about this lady called Ruth Hadley was that she felt in the olden days, like probably the 50s or 60s or something, I'm not sure, that, UK missionaries went to do things for the Africans. And she felt that was completely the wrong way to go about it, that you had to go being prepared to do things with them and under their authority.
Yeah.
And she wanted to give them that dignity. And it was quite interesting talking to some of the people in the stories they told me that indicated that it was really, really important to get rid of this colonial attitude and colonialism. So her book, her story is called Angola in My Heart, because that was what it was for her. And so that's the one that's published. The one I'm working on right now is number 4 in my Scottish trilogy. That's the one I'm away in the National Library reading these 1600s, late 1500s, 1600s letters for. And it is set in the context of an unsolved mystery from August 1600 called the Gowrie Conspiracy. And this is where a nobleman and his next brother were murdered by followers of James VI. James, the story is that they enticed him to their house and they were going to capture him. So he called for help from his followers, who then promptly murdered these 2 guys. The family story is that James set the whole thing up because for past treasonous acts that this family had been involved in, he wanted to kill them. Nobody to this day has been able to determine where the truth lies. I'm not actually going to be writing directly. I'm not going to try and solve that riddle. If people haven't been able to solve it for 400 years, I'm not going to try.
I don't know, you might be the one.
But there were two younger brothers who were sort of 15, 16 at that stage. And I'm writing about the fallout that they suffered. One of them ended up in the Tower of London for 18 years, for example.
Yeah.
And managed to qualify as a doctor while he was there.
Margaret, both these books are so different and they sound so incredible and fascinating, and I think it's absolutely amazing. Yeah, I'm really inspired. Like I said, I am leaving this really inspired with where I'm going on my writing, and thank you very much.
Good luck with what you're doing at the minute too.
You'll
probably write about 3 more books before I get this one finished.
Oh, I don't know. It's all depends how often I can lock myself away, doesn't it? How many sort of weekends? I think the Shetland Islands would be amazing for that. Thank you.
Personally, I would prefer the Seychelles weather-wise.
I may suggest that to Jake. We put that down as a business expense. I'm not sure it would work. Margaret, thank you so much for being here on WACI with us. I have enjoyed this interview so much. If you have enjoyed listening to it or watching on YouTube, please can you make sure that you hit the like and the subscribe button so that you don't miss any future episodes, because hopefully they're going to continue to be this fabulous. So thank you, Margaret, once again, and thank you to anybody who's out there listening.
And if anybody wants to get in touch with me, they can get in touch with me via my website, which is www.margaretskea.com. And I love to hear from people.
And we'll put links down or below or above. I don't really know where links go. That's not my part, but they go below on YouTube, don't they? So you'll find all the links to Margaret's books and her website below on there. So thank you again.